James Harrington stared out the window of his corner office, watching the city bustle 40 floors below. The view never got old, even after 5 years as CEO of Lux Motor Industries. He turned back to his desk where quarterly reports lay scattered, each page filled with numbers that told a troubling story. "This can't be right," he muttered, running his hand through his graying hair. Lux Motor had built its reputation on quality automotive parts. Their slogan, "Perfection in every part," wasn't just marketing. It had been their guiding principle since James's father started the company in their garage 30 years ago. But these reports showed increasing defects, more warranty claims, and most concerning, a rise in workplace incidents at garages using their products. James picked up his coffee mug, only to find it empty. He pressed the intercom button on his desk phone. "Rose, could you bring me another coffee, please, and let me know when Tom arrives?" "Right away, Mr. Harrington," his assistant responded. "And Mr. Benson is already waiting in the lobby," James sighed. Tom Benson, the chief financial officer, had been pushing for cost-cutting measures for the past year. The board loved him for it. Profits were up 12%. But these reports suggested there was more to the story. Rose knocked gently before entering with a fresh cup of coffee. "Should I send Mr. Benson in?" "Give me 5 minutes," James replied, taking the mug gratefully. After Rose left, James turned to the framed photo on his desk, his father standing proudly in front of the first Lux Motor factory. "What would you do, Dad?" he whispered. When Tom Benson entered, his confident stride matched his perfectly tailored suit. At 35, he was the youngest executive on the team and never let anyone forget his Harvard MBA. "James, good news from the board meeting this morning," Tom said, dropping into a chair without waiting for an invitation. "They've approved the next phase of supplier consolidation. We can squeeze another 3% margin out of—" "I've been looking at the quality reports," James interrupted, sliding a folder across the desk. Tom's smile faltered slightly. "Oh, those. Yes, there's been some minor fluctuation in our metrics, but nothing to worry about." "Minor?" James raised an eyebrow. "Warranty claims are up 40%. We've had 3 garages report injuries from failing parts in the last month alone." Tom waved dismissively. "Growing pains from the new suppliers. They're still adjusting to our standards. The numbers will stabilize, and what about this?" James pulled out another report. "Customer satisfaction has dropped to its lowest point in our history." "James," Tom leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "The board is thrilled with our financial performance. The shareholders are happy. Stock price is up. Isn't that what matters?" James felt his jaw tighten. "No, Tom, it's not all that matters." Their conversation was interrupted by James's phone ringing. Rose's voice came through the speaker. "Mr. Harrington, the board is requesting an emergency video call. They've seen the quality reports." 20 minutes later, James sat alone in the conference room, the video call having ended on a sour note. The board members, especially the newer ones who never knew his father, had been harsh. Their concern wasn't about the failing parts or injured mechanics. It was about potential lawsuits and bad press. Fix it quickly and quietly, the board chair had instructed before. Disconnecting. James walked back to his office slowly, nodding to employees who greeted him in the hallway. Did they know what was happening? Were they proud of the work they were doing? He stopped by the company museum, a small room showcasing Lux Motor's history. Display cases held the original tools his father used, along with the first successful parts they'd created. A video played on loop, showing mechanics praising Lux Motor's reliability. One interview caught his attention. A gray-haired mechanic with oil-stained hands saying, "When I see the Lux Motor logo, I don't even have to check the part. I know it's good. I trust it with my life every day." Trust. That was what they were losing. Back in his office, James called Rose in. "Cancel my meetings for the rest of the week. And contact HR. Tell them I need a new identity created." Rose looked confused. "Sir?" "I'm going undercover, Rose. Our customers are telling us something's wrong and I need to see it for myself." "Undercover?" Rose repeated. "Like on those reality TV shows?" James smiled for the first time that day. "Exactly like that. But no cameras. No one can know, especially Tom and the board." Over the next 2 days, James worked with a small, trusted team to create his new identity. Jim Harris, an experienced mechanic looking for work after relocating to the city. HR provided fake references and a work history that would stand up to basic scrutiny. His wife, Linda, laughed when he showed her the transformation. Gone was the designer suit, replaced by worn jeans and a faded work shirt. His executive haircut hidden under a baseball cap. 3 days without shaving had given him a scruffy look that made him appear older than his 52 years. "You look like you did when we first met," she said, adjusting his cap. "Before all this." She gestured vaguely toward their penthouse windows. "That was a lifetime ago," James replied. "I'm not sure I remember how to work with my hands anymore." Linda squeezed his shoulder. "It's like riding a bike. You grew up in your dad's garage. It'll come back to you." The next morning, James drove his rarely used pickup truck to Crossroads Garage on the outskirts of the city. It was one of the busiest service centers in the region and exclusively used Lux Motor parts, at least according to their contracts. The garage was already humming with activity when he arrived at 4:45 a.m. Cars lined the parking lot, and the air smelled of oil, rubber, and exhaust, so different from the sanitized, air-freshened environment of his corporate office. The reception area was small and cluttered with parts, catalogs, and coffee-stained customer forms. A harried-looking woman glanced up from the computer. "Help you?" she asked, answering a ringing phone with her other hand. "I'm Jim Harris. Starting today. Should be on the schedule." She held up one finger while finishing the call, then typed something into her computer. "Right, new guy. Frank's expecting you." She pointed toward a door. "Through there, find the guy yelling the loudest." The main garage area was enormous, with 12 bays all occupied by vehicles in various states of repair. The noise was overwhelming. Pneumatic tools, clanging metal, engines revving, and rock music playing from multiple radios, each tuned to different stations. Frank wasn't hard to find. A barrel-chested man with a booming voice was gesturing animatedly at a group of mechanics gathered around an opened engine. James approached cautiously, suddenly feeling out of place. It had been decades since he'd actually worked in a garage. What if they immediately saw through his disguise? Frank noticed him hovering. "You Harris?" James nodded, extending his hand. "Yes, sir." "Ready to start?" Frank's handshake was brief and crushing. "We'll see about that. Got your paperwork here." He glanced at a folder. "Says you worked at Wilson's in Pittsburgh for 8 years?" "Yes, sir. Until they closed down last month." Frank seemed to soften slightly. "Shame about Wilson's. Good shop. Let's see what you're made of." He turned and bellowed across the garage. "Miguel, got your new helper." A man in his 30s looked up from under the hood of a luxury sedan. He wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, his movements betraying a slight limp. "Miguel Rodriguez," Frank said. "Best damn transmission guy in the state. Also the grumpiest. He'll show you the ropes." Frank handed Miguel the folder. "Don't scare this one off before lunch, okay?" Miguel didn't smile. He simply nodded at James. "You ever work on European imports?" "Some," James answered truthfully. "More experienced with domestics." "Today's your lucky day then," Miguel said, turning back toward the sedan. "We've got a transmission job on a car that costs more than I'll make in 5 years. Follow me." As James trailed behind his new supervisor, he noticed something odd. Miguel's tool belt contained several pieces that looked wrong, modified somehow with tape and wire reinforcements. Miguel pointed to a rusty toolbox. "You can use that one for now. Most of your basic stuff should be in there." James opened it to find a disorganized collection of tools, many bearing the Lux Motor logo. But unlike the pristine examples in the company's ads, these were worn, some clearly broken and repaired multiple times. "Problem?" Miguel asked, noticing James's expression. "No," James replied quickly. "Just getting oriented." "Well, get oriented faster," Miguel said, sliding under the car. "We've got 8 more jobs after this one, and the day's already started without us." James took a deep breath and knelt down beside the car, feeling completely out of his depth. This was going to be harder than he thought. But somewhere in this garage were answers to what was happening to his father's company, and he was determined to find them. He just hoped he could make it through the day without giving himself away. Or worse, damaging someone's very expensive car. By lunchtime, James's back was screaming in protest. He straightened up slowly, one hand pressed against his lower spine, and tried not to wince. The casual physical labor that had once been second nature to him now felt like torture after years behind a desk. "You good?" Miguel asked. Not looking up from the transmission he was carefully reassembling. "Just need to stretch." James replied, trying to sound casual, not used to these concrete floors yet. Miguel grunted. Nobody ever gets used to them. That's why half the guys here have bad knees by 40. He tightened a bolt with practiced efficiency. Lunch is 30 minutes. There's a sandwich truck that parks out back, or you can use the break room fridge if you brought something. James hadn't thought to pack a lunch. I'll check out the truck. Can I get you anything? Miguel finally looked up, surprise briefly crossing his face. Sure. Turkey on rye if they have it. No mayo. He reached for his wallet, but James waved him off. My treat. Consider it thanks for showing me the ropes. Outside, the midday sun was blinding after hours under fluorescent lights. James joined a line of mechanics and office workers at a battered food truck. He ordered 2 sandwiches and bottles of water, then hesitated before adding 2 chocolate chip cookies to his order. When he returned, Miguel had moved to a small table wedged in the corner of the garage, away from the noisy break room. James set the food down and eased himself onto a metal stool, trying not to groan. Added something sweet, James said, sliding a cookie toward Miguel. Figured we earned it. Miguel stared at the cookie like it was a foreign object. Thanks. After a moment's hesitation, he unwrapped his sandwich and took a bite. They ate in silence for several minutes. James used the opportunity to study the garage more carefully. 10 mechanics worked across the 12 bays, each focused intently on their tasks. Despite the rock music and occasional shouts, there was an underlying system to the chaos, a well-practiced dance of bodies and tools moving around the vehicles. So, James ventured, you been here long? Miguel nodded. 8 years at Crossroads. Was at Peter's Auto before that until they got bought out. You like it here? Miguel shrugged. Frank's fair. Pays decent. Could be worse. He took another bite, chewed thoughtfully. You worked on transmissions much? Some, James admitted. But nothing like you. That disassembly was impressive. A hint of pride flickered across Miguel's face. Transmissions make sense. Not like people. They tell you exactly what's wrong if you know how to listen. James smiled. My dad used to say something similar. He was a mechanic too. He's still working? No, he passed about 10 years ago. Miguel nodded respectfully. Sorry to hear that. Their brief moment of connection was interrupted by Frank's booming voice. Rodriguez. Phone call. Some customer asking about that Mercedes. Miguel sighed, wrapping the remainder of his sandwich. Back to it. He stood up, his left leg stiffening momentarily. James noticed the slight wince before Miguel masked it. Problem with your leg? James asked. Old injury, Miguel replied dismissively. Acts up when the weather changes. The afternoon proved even more challenging than the morning. Miguel assigned James to help with an oil change, a simple task that should have been routine. But the oil filter wrench kept slipping, its grip worn beyond usefulness. This thing is shot, James muttered after his third attempt. Welcome to Crossroads, Miguel replied dryly. We make do. He pulled a strip of rubber from his pocket and wrapped it around the handle of the wrench for better grip. Try now. The makeshift fix worked, but James couldn't help noticing it wasn't the only improvised tool in use. Throughout the afternoon, he spotted mechanics using pliers with handles wrapped in tape, extension bars reinforced with wire, and sockets with homemade adapters. Most concerning were the safety shortcuts, jack stands positioned incorrectly, missing wheel chocks, mechanics working under lifts that hadn't been properly secured. Each observation made James's stomach tighten. These weren't just quality issues. They were safety hazards waiting to happen. By 5 o'clock, James's hands were cut and scraped, his muscles ached, and his mind was racing with everything he'd seen. As mechanics began cleaning up their stations, Frank appeared at his side. So, Harris, you surviving? Yes, sir, James replied. Learning a lot, Frank nodded approvingly. Miguel says you didn't mess anything up too badly. That's high praise coming from him. He handed James a time card. Fill this out, bring it back tomorrow. 7 sharp. I'll be here, James promised. As the garage emptied, James noticed Miguel lingering, carefully organizing his tools in a large red toolbox. Unlike the communal tools, Miguel's personal collection seemed better maintained, though many still showed signs of repair and modification. Need a hand? James offered. Miguel shook his head. I got it. After a moment's hesitation, he added, You did okay today. For a new guy, coming from the reserved mechanic, it felt like high praise. Thanks, mind if I ask you something? Miguel shrugged. I noticed a lot of the tools here seem improvised. Is that normal? Miguel's expression darkened. You want the official answer or the real one? The real one. Miguel closed his toolbox before speaking. 2 years ago, management started cutting corners. New parts suppliers, cheaper materials. Budget for equipment maintenance got slashed. He pointed to a nearby lift. That should have been replaced last year. Hydraulics are shot, but we keep patching it. Isn't that dangerous? Everything here is dangerous if you're not careful, Miguel replied matter-of-factly. We adapt, make things work. And the Lux motor parts? James asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. I noticed you had to modify that control arm before installing it. Miguel's eyes narrowed slightly. You noticed that, huh? I pay attention. After a long pause, Miguel said, Lux motor used to be the gold standard. Would have bet my life on their parts. He reached into his toolbox and pulled out a small metal component. This is one of their ball joints from 5 years ago. He placed it next to a nearly identical piece from earlier that day. And this is what they're sending us now. Even to James's untrained eye, the difference was obvious. The older part was solid, precisely machined. The newer one looked similar but lacked the same quality of finish. They changed the alloy, Miguel explained. Cheaper metal, thinner casting. Looks the same to customers, but we can tell. They fail twice as fast but cost the same premium price. James felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Has anyone reported this? Miguel laughed without humor. You think they care what a bunch of grease monkeys have to say? I've sent complaint forms every month for a year. Never even got a response. He replaced the parts in his toolbox. That's how it goes. Big companies forget who actually uses their products. The irony of the statement wasn't lost on James. Here he was, the CEO of that very company, completely unaware of the complaints anyway. Miguel continued, you get used to it. Find workarounds. He gestured to a wall of tools. Half those wrenches have been modified to work with the new parts. Not ideal, but we make it work. Even if it's dangerous? James pressed. Miguel studied him for a moment. You ask a lot of questions for a new guy. Just trying to learn the ropes, James replied, trying to sound casual. Well, here's a free lesson, Miguel said, closing his toolbox with a definitive click. In this business, you either adapt or you find another job. Nobody's coming to save us. As James drove home that evening, his body aching and mind racing, Miguel's words echoed in his head. Nobody's coming to save us. The irony was almost painful. He was supposed to be that somebody, the CEO responsible for the well-being of everyone who touched his products. Somewhere between his father's garage and the executive suite, he'd lost sight of what mattered most. The quality issues weren't just numbers on a report. They were real problems affecting real people every day. Tomorrow would be day 2 of his undercover mission. James made a mental note to pay closer attention to those modified tools. If Miguel was right, they weren't just dealing with a quality issue, but a genuine safety crisis, and if that was true, James had far more to fix than he'd initially thought. James arrived at Crossroads Garage the next morning with a new sense of purpose. He'd spent half the night researching his own company's recent manufacturing changes, digging through files that normally never crossed his desk. What he found disturbed him. Material specifications had indeed been quietly downgraded over the past 18 months, right around the time Tom had implemented his supplier optimization program. The garage was already humming with activity when he walked in at 6:45. Miguel was hunched over a workbench, coffee in one hand, studying a repair manual with intense concentration. Morning, James said, setting down his own coffee next to Miguel's. Miguel looked up, surprised. You brought coffee? Figured we could both use it. Extra strong, black. Miguel accepted the cup with a nod that might have been gratitude. Frank wants us on the transmission job again. Customers picking it up today. As they worked, James found himself falling into a rhythm with Miguel. Despite his executive status, James had grown up working in garages. His father had insisted he learn every aspect of the business from the ground up. Those muscle memories were coming back even if his actual muscles protested. Hand me that 10mm socket, Miguel said from under the car. James reached for the toolbox, but hesitated when he saw the socket. The Lux Motor logo was clearly stamped on it, but the tool had been modified, wrapped with a thin strip of metal and secured with wire. What happened to this one? James asked, handing it down. Miguel glanced at it. Wall thickness is too thin on the new ones. They split under pressure. He pointed to a hairline crack. This one's already starting to go. Had to reinforce it. James examined other tools in the box while Miguel worked. Nearly every Lux motor piece showed similar modifications or repairs. Some were clearly jury-rigged from desperation rather than proper fixes. How often do these tools fail? James asked, trying to sound casual. Depends. Sockets maybe every couple months. Ratchets last about half as long as they used to. Miguel slid out from under the car, wiping grease from his hands. Why so interested in the tools? James shrugged. Just curious. Seems dangerous. Everything's dangerous if you're not paying attention. Miguel stood up, wincing slightly as he put weight on his left leg. Your leg bothering you again? Miguel's face closed off. It's fine. Doesn't look fine. For a moment, James thought Miguel would walk away. Instead, the mechanic sighed and leaned against the workbench. Had an accident last year. Torque wrench failed during a job, same model we're using today. He tapped his left thigh. 17 stitches and a metal rod. Doctor says I'll probably walk with a limp for the rest of my life. James felt sick. The wrench was a Lux motor? Miguel nodded. Used to swear by them. Now we just swear at them. He attempted a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Company sent a fruit basket when I got out of the hospital. Form letter signed by some VP. James made a mental note to check the incident reports when he got back to his office. Why hadn't he heard about this? They worked through the morning, finishing the transmission job just before lunch. As they cleaned up, Frank approached. Got a customer waiting on Bay 3. Says his brakes are squealing. Check it out. The customer, a nervous-looking man in his 30s, hovered nearby as James and Miguel began their inspection. I just had the brakes replaced 3 months ago, the man explained. But they started making this awful noise last week. Miguel nodded professionally. We'll take a look. Once the car was on the lift, the problem became immediately obvious. The brake pads were worn unevenly and one of the calipers was sticking. These pads are shot, Miguel said, shaking his head. And look at this caliper. The piston's not retracting properly. James examined the parts more closely. These are Lux motor pads? Supposed to be, Miguel replied. But I've seen counterfeits. Let me check something. He disappeared into the back office, returning a few minutes later with a small magnifying glass. Look at this. Under magnification, James could see tiny imperfections in the Lux motor logo stamped on the brake pad backing. Fake? He asked. Miguel shook his head. That's the problem. They're real. But the quality's so bad now they look like knockoffs. He pointed to the pad material. This compound is all wrong, too soft. That's why it's wearing unevenly. Could that be dangerous? Brakes? Yeah, they're kind of important. Miguel's sarcasm wasn't lost on James. Worst case, they could fail completely. Best case, customer comes back every few months for replacements. They replace the pads and fix the caliper. But the conversation stuck with James throughout the afternoon. How many other cars were driving around with substandard parts bearing his company's name? How many accidents waiting to happen? By mid-afternoon, the garage was packed. A steady rain had brought in a flood of customers with minor issues. Burned-out headlights, wiper problems, batteries killed by the damp weather. James found himself working alongside Miguel on a seemingly endless stream of quick jobs. You're not half bad when you focus, Miguel commented as they finished their 8th repair of the afternoon. Sure you just worked at Wilson's? You've got skills. James felt a pang of guilt at the compliment. My dad taught me a lot. I just haven't used it in a while. As the day wore on, James noticed Miguel struggling more with his injured leg. By 5 o'clock, the mechanic was clearly in pain, though he tried to hide it. During a rare quiet moment, James found the courage to ask about something that had been bothering him. Those reports you said you sent to Lux Motor, do you still have copies? Miguel gave him a curious look. Why? Just wondering what they said. Might help me avoid making the same mistakes. After a moment's hesitation, Miguel nodded toward the back of the garage. In my locker. I kept copies of everything. The end of the shift couldn't come soon enough for James. His back ached, his hands were raw, and his mind was racing with everything he'd learned. When Frank finally called time, the relief was palpable throughout the garage. As the other mechanics headed out, Miguel limped to his locker and pulled out a thick folder. Here, he said, handing it to James. Every report I sent. Never got a single response. James opened the folder, stunned by what he found. Detailed descriptions of failing parts. Photographs documenting the decline in quality. safety concerns highlighted in red. The most recent report was dated just 2 weeks ago. There's got to be 20 reports here, James said, flipping through the pages. 27, Miguel corrected. Started sending them monthly, then weekly when things got worse. He sat heavily on a nearby stool, massaging his thigh. After my accident, I figured somebody should know what was happening. Guess I was wrong. James felt a mixture of shame and anger building inside him. These reports should have reached his desk. Someone at Lux Motor was burying serious safety concerns. Mind if I borrow these? James asked. I'd like to study them more closely. Miguel shrugged. Keep them. I've got digital copies. Not that it matters. Nobody's listening anyway. As Miguel packed up his tools, James noticed him grimacing in pain. Your leg's really bothering you today, isn't it? Miguel didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, bad days happen. I deal with it. How'd the accident happen exactly? With the torque wrench? Miguel's eyes darkened with the memory. Working on a truck axle. Needed precise torque on the lug nuts. The wrench head split clean off at full tension. His hand unconsciously moved to his thigh. 20 pounds of metal and a broken socket went straight into my leg. Lucky it didn't hit an artery. James swallowed hard. And you're sure it was a manufacturing defect? 100%. Wasn't user error or over-torquing. The metal just gave way. Miguel looked at him curiously. Why all these questions? Just trying to understand, James replied honestly. Seems like somebody should be held accountable. Yeah, well, good luck with that. Miguel closed his toolbox with finality. Big companies don't care about guys like us. We're just numbers on a spreadsheet. As James watched Miguel limp toward the exit, those words hit him like a physical blow. Because until 2 days ago, that's exactly what Miguel had been to him. A nameless, faceless number in a quality report. Tomorrow, James decided, he would dig even deeper. Something was very wrong at his company, and he was beginning to suspect it went far beyond simple cost-cutting measures. James spent most of the night studying Miguel's reports. Each one documented problems with Lux Motor parts in painstaking detail, complete with photographs, measurements, and safety concerns. The reports were professional, thorough, and deeply troubling. How had these never reached his desk? Around midnight, he called Rose, his executive assistant. I need you to check something, he said after apologizing for the late hour. Find out where quality complaints from service centers are processed. Customer Relations handles those, Rose replied without hesitation. Though I believe they were moved under Tom's division during last year's reorganization. That explained a lot. Tom had created a bottleneck for information that might contradict his cost-cutting narrative. One more thing, James added. Look into any workplace injury reports involving a mechanic named Miguel Rodriguez. Should be from about a year ago. He arrived at Crossroads Garage early the next morning, determined to talk more with Miguel about the reports. But as he walked in, he sensed something was wrong. The usual morning banter was missing, replaced by hushed conversations and worried looks. Frank stood near the time clock, his typically boisterous demeanor subdued. Everything okay? James asked. Frank shook his head. Miguel called in. Won't be here today? He's sick. His leg. Bad flare-up from his old injury. Frank lowered his voice. Between us, it happens more than he lets on. Usually works through it, but must be really bad this time. James felt a twinge of concern. Is he seeing a doctor? Can't afford to. Insurance from the accident settlement barely covered the surgeries. Frank sighed. Anyway, you'll be working with Pete today. Bay 5. Pete turned out to be a chatty mechanic in his 20s who was more interested in his phone than the repairs. James spent the morning fixing simple problems while half listening to Pete's running commentary about local sports teams. During lunch, James checked his own phone for the first time that day. 3 missed calls from Rose and a text message. Urgent. Call me immediately about Rodriguez case. He stepped outside to return the call. What did you find? He asked when Rose answered. It's worse than I thought, she replied, her voice tight. Miguel Rodriguez filed a product liability claim against Lux Motor last year, after a serious workplace injury. Our legal department settled quickly with a non-disclosure agreement. That makes sense, James said. But where's the problem? The problem is what happened to his reports afterward. I checked the system logs. Every quality report from Crossroads Garage has been automatically flagged and diverted since the settlement. They never entered the regular review process. James felt his blood pressure rising. Who authorized that? The directive came from legal, but Tom Benson signed off on it. There's an internal memo stating that Rodriguez was considered a nuisance reporter after the settlement. A nuisance? James nearly shouted, then lowered his voice as a passing mechanic gave him a curious look. He was injured by our defective product and we're ignoring his safety concerns. There's more, Rose continued. I checked other service centers. After the supplier changes, quality complaints increased by over 200%. But the reports Tom's team has been providing to you and the board show complaints decreasing. They've been filtering the data, James said, the realization hitting him hard, manipulating the numbers to hide the problems. It appears so, Rose confirmed. What do you want me to do? James thought for a moment. Nothing yet. I need one more day here, but schedule an emergency executive meeting for tomorrow afternoon. And Rose? Don't tell Tom. The rest of the workday passed in a blur. James went through the motions of repairs while his mind raced with what he'd learned. The deception went deeper than he'd imagined. It wasn't just cost-cutting. It was a deliberate cover-up of safety issues. After his shift ended, James made a decision. He needed to see Miguel. Frank was reluctant to share Miguel's address, but finally relented when James explained he wanted to drop off some paperwork from the previous day's jobs. 20 minutes later, James was knocking on the door of a modest apartment in a working-class neighborhood. When Miguel opened the door, leaning heavily on a crutch, the surprise on his face was evident. Jim, what are you doing here? Brought the work orders from yesterday, James said, holding up a folder. Thought you might want to check them. Miguel hesitated, then stepped aside. Come in, I guess. The apartment was small but meticulously organized, much like Miguel's toolbox. A worn couch faced a small television, and the coffee table was covered with automotive magazines and repair manuals. How's the leg? James asked as Miguel lowered himself carefully onto the couch. Been better, Miguel admitted. Flares up sometimes. Should be back tomorrow. James nodded toward a framed photograph on the wall. Miguel in hospital scrubs standing next to an older woman. Family, my mom. She's a nurse at County General. A hint of pride crept into Miguel's voice. Worked double shifts for 20 years to put me through technical school. James studied the photo, seeing Miguel in a new light. Not just a skilled mechanic, but someone's son. Someone with dreams and aspirations beyond the garage. I looked through your reports, James said, sitting down across from Miguel. They're incredibly detailed, Miguel shrugged. A lot of good it did. Why keep sending them if nobody responded? Because it's the right thing to do, Miguel said simply. Because someone could get hurt like I did. Because my mom raised me to speak up when something's wrong, even if nobody's listening. James felt a lump forming in his throat. This was the integrity his father had built Lux Motor on, the values that had gotten lost somewhere along the way. Can I ask you something? James said after a moment. If you could talk directly to the CEO of Lux Motor, what would you tell him? Miguel gave a short, humorless laugh. That's easy. I'd tell him to get off his fancy chair and see what's happening in the real world. I'd show him these. Miguel reached for a drawer in the coffee table and pulled out a small plastic container. Inside were various broken tool pieces, each labeled with a date. Every Lux Motor tool that's failed on me in the past year, Miguel explained. This one nearly took my eye out. This one shattered and sent shrapnel into Carl's arm. He needed 5 stitches. This one failed while I was working under a car. If the backup jack hadn't held, I'd be dead. James picked up one of the metal fragments, turning it over in his hand. The Lux Motor logo was still visible, though partly obscured by a stress fracture. I'd tell him, Miguel continued, his voice growing more passionate, that his name is on these tools, that people trust them with their lives every day, that cutting corners to save a few bucks might look good on quarterly reports, but it's putting real people in danger. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. James stared at the broken tool in his hand, the physical evidence of his company's betrayal of trust. You really think he doesn't know? James asked quietly. Miguel considered the question. I don't know. Maybe he's just a money guy who never worked with his hands. Maybe he's surrounded by yes men who filter what he sees. Or maybe he just doesn't care as long as profits stay up. The assessment stung, but James couldn't deny its potential truth. Had he become so focused on numbers that he'd forgotten the people behind them? I should go, James said, standing up. Thanks for showing me these. Keep this one, Miguel said, handing him one of the broken tool pieces. Next time you're using a ratchet and it feels loose, remember it could be your hand getting mangled next. James pocketed the piece, its weight suddenly seeming much heavier than its actual mass. I'll see you tomorrow? He asked. Miguel nodded. Yeah, I'll be there. As James drove home, his decision crystallized. Tomorrow would be his last day undercover. He had seen enough, learned enough. It was time to return to his role as CEO and fix what had gone so terribly wrong. But first, there was one more thing he needed to witness. The most dangerous repair bay in the garage, where Miguel had told him the modified tools were used most often. If he was going to make this right, he needed to understand exactly how bad things had become. James arrived early for his final day undercover, determined to work in the most dangerous section of the garage. According to Miguel, Bay 12 was where they handled the heaviest jobs. Transmission swaps on trucks, engine rebuilds, axle replacements. It was also where they used the most modified tools to compensate for failing Luxmotor equipment. Frank looked surprised when James requested the assignment. Bay 12, that's Miguel's territory. Nobody else usually works there. He showed me some of the techniques yesterday, James lied smoothly. Thought I could get started on the prep work before he arrives. Frank hesitated, then shrugged. Your funeral. Just don't break anything expensive. Bay 12 was tucked in the back corner of the garage, partially separated from the others by tall toolboxes. James immediately understood why Miguel preferred it. The isolation provided focus, away from the constant noise and movement of the main floor. A heavy-duty pickup truck sat on the lift, its transmission already partially disassembled. James recognized it as the job Miguel had mentioned yesterday, a complete rebuild of a failing transmission for a local construction company. He surveyed the workbench where Miguel had carefully laid out the tools needed for the job. Almost every piece showed signs of modification. Reinforced handles, added grip surfaces, strengthened joints. Even more concerning were the makeshift safety measures. Homemade shields attached to power tools, extra restraints on the lift, secondary support jacks placed strategically around the vehicle. James picked up a torque wrench, the same model that had failed and injured Miguel a year ago. He could see where the neck had been reinforced with a metal collar and wrapped with high-strength tape. The modifications were clever, but inadequate replacements for properly manufactured tools. He was examining a socket set when Miguel's voice startled him. Didn't expect to see you. Here. James turned to find Miguel standing at the entrance to the bay, still favoring his bad leg but without the crutch from yesterday. Thought I'd get a head start, James explained. Frank said it was okay. Miguel nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with someone else in his workspace. We've got a lot to do today. Owner needs this truck back by 5. They worked side by side through the morning, dismantling the remainder of the transmission. James found himself impressed by Miguel's methodical approach. Each part carefully removed, cleaned, and inspected before being either set aside for reuse or placed in a separate bin for replacement. This bearing is shot, Miguel said, holding up a small metal ring. And look at the race, it was scoring all the way around. James examined it. Manufacturing defect? Most likely. Metal's too soft. Miguel tossed it into the replacement bin. We're seeing more of these failures lately. Parts that should last years giving out in months. As the day progressed, James found himself learning more than he had in all his years as CEO. Miguel explained each step of the rebuild process, pointing out where corners had been cut in the newer replacement parts and how they compensated with modifications and extra care during installation. This gasket material is too thin, Miguel demonstrated, holding up a transmission seal. So we double them up. Not ideal, but better than leaks. By lunchtime, they had the transmission partially reassembled. James's hands ached, but he felt a sense of accomplishment that spreadsheets and board meetings never provided. They were just returning from their lunch break when a loud crash came from Bay 9, followed by shouting. James and Miguel rushed over to find a mechanic named Dave standing beside a car, clutching his bleeding hand. A damaged socket wrench lay on the floor. What happened? Frank demanded, pushing through the gathered mechanics. Wrench head split while I was loosening the axle nut, Dave explained through gritted teeth. Caught my hand on the rebound. James looked at the broken tool, another Luxmotor product, its failure identical to what had injured Miguel's leg. The garage nurse quickly bandaged Dave's hand, which thankfully had suffered only a deep cut rather than broken bones. As the excitement died down and mechanics returned to their work, James noticed Miguel staring at the broken wrench, his face tight with anger. "That's the third one this month," Miguel said quietly. They returned to Bay 12 in somber silence. As they resumed work on the transmission, James could sense Miguel's growing frustration. "You okay?" James asked after Miguel cursed under his breath when a bolt wouldn't seat properly. Miguel set down his wrench with deliberate care. "No, I'm not okay. Dave got lucky. Next time it could be much worse." He rubbed his thigh unconsciously. "Nobody should get hurt just doing their job." "I agree," James said. "But what can we do? Companies like Lux Motor don't care about guys like us." Miguel picked up a modified torque wrench. "We're just numbers to them." James couldn't stay silent any longer. What if they did care? What if the CEO knew what was happening? Miguel gave a bitter laugh. "Right. I'm sure he's real concerned while sitting in his corner office. But what if he didn't know? What if someone was hiding these problems from him?" Miguel studied James with sudden suspicion. "Why do you care so much about this? You've been here 3 days and you're asking more questions than anyone I've ever met." James knew the moment had come. He couldn't maintain the deception any longer. "Because I need to know the truth," he said carefully. "Because the people who rely on these tools deserve better." "And why is that your problem?" Miguel pressed. James took a deep breath. "Because I'm the CEO of Lux Motor Industries." The silence that followed was deafening. Miguel stared at him, disbelief slowly giving way to understanding, then anger. "You're James Harrington?" James nodded. "I came here because quality reports showed problems, but I needed to see it firsthand. I needed to understand what was really happening." Miguel's face hardened. "So this was what? Some reality TV stunt? Playing mechanic to ease your conscience?" "No," James insisted. "I genuinely didn't know how bad things had gotten. Your reports never reached me. They were being filtered out after your accident settlement." "Convenient excuse," Miguel said coldly. "You expect me to believe the CEO had no idea his products were failing? That people were getting hurt? I saw the numbers, but they were manipulated. The executive in charge of our cost-cutting program has been hiding the real data." James held Miguel's gaze. "I should have looked closer. I should have asked more questions. That's on me, and I'm sorry." Miguel picked up a rag and wiped his hands methodically, his movements controlled despite his obvious anger. "Sorry doesn't fix Dave's hand. Sorry doesn't give me back full use of my leg." "You're right," James agreed. "Words aren't enough. That's why I'm going to fix this." "How? Wave your magic CEO wand and suddenly all the tools work again?" "By rebuilding everything from the ground up if I have to," James said firmly. "By firing the people responsible for the cover-up. By putting quality and safety back at the center of what we do." Miguel shook his head, unconvinced. "Pretty words." "Not just words," James insisted. "I want you to help me. Come back to Lux Motor with me. Head up a new quality control division that reports directly to me. No filters, no one to bury your reports. Your experience, your knowledge of what works and what doesn't. That's exactly what we need." Miguel stared at him, searching for any sign of insincerity. "Why would I trust you?" "Because I've seen what happens when I don't listen to the people who actually use our products. Because my father built this company on quality, and I won't let his legacy die." James held out his hand. "Help me make this right." For a long moment, Miguel didn't move. Then slowly, he extended his hand. "I'm not doing it for you. I'm doing it for Dave and every other mechanic who depends on these tools." "That's exactly why I want you," James said as they shook hands. "You care about the right things." Frank's voice boomed across the garage. "Rodriguez!" "Phone call." "Take it," James said. "I'll finish up here." As Miguel limped away, James returned to the transmission, tightening bolts with a renewed sense of purpose. His undercover journey was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Tomorrow he would return to his office, armed with the truth and determined to rebuild his company's integrity bolt by bolt. He glanced down at his grease-stained hands that had spent too many years signing papers and not enough years building things that mattered. That would change starting today. Sometimes, he reflected, you have to go back to your roots to remember what made you strong in the first place.